We have three distinguished panelists, although we'll only see two here. I'll explain why in a moment. First panelist is Keith Watenpaugh, who is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the University of California Davis Human Rights Initiative. The second speaker will be Ken MacLean, who is Associate Professor of International Development and Social Change here at Clark University. Our third panelist will be Emma Frances Bloomfield, who is a PhD candidate at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California. The first paper is Keith Watenpaugh's. It is entitled The Materiality of Armenian Genocide Denial. Unfortunately, Keith couldn't be with us today, but we will be seeing he has recorded his presentation by video, and he will be participating in the question and answer by Skype, so he will be here to answer your questions. He will be on the screen rather than in person. We'll hope that the technology works for us. So, are we ready for the video for the first presentation, Sarah?
Yeah.
So this is The Materiality of Armenian Genocide Denial.
Good afternoon. My name is Keith Watenpaugh. I'm an Associate Professor of Human Rights Studies at the University of California, Davis. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference for both inviting me and letting me participate in this somewhat non-traditional means. Just a little bit about myself. I work on the history of human rights and humanitarianism in the Middle East. I'm author of several works on the humanitarian response to the Armenian genocide, and most notably I have a book coming out after the first year, Bread from Stones, the Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, which looks at the way humanitarianism is a modern ideology formed in part around the needs created by the aftermath of the Armenian genocide and the creation of a vast population of displaced survivors and attempts to resettle and to achieve justice for them. Second, this talk gives me a moment to briefly reflect about the fact that over the length of my entire career, I've watched the broader field of late Ottoman history transform and move to a much better understanding and acknowledgement of the history of violence against civilians, as well as the persisting structures of violence which shape politics and society in the contemporary Middle East. The mainstream of historians in the Middle East and out accept the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians and Assyrians as a fact of history, something I don't need to explain in silence. However, today I'll address strategies of the margin, where forms of denial persist as a function of the outsized role of politically motivated private giving to cash-strapped public universities, and the way denial can exploit the inherent weaknesses of the forms of scholarly review. Before that, 20 years ago, when I was a graduate student at UCLA, it was not the case that such acceptance by the community of Middle Eastern historians and others was widespread. Despite the fact that Richard Hovannisian was on faculty there at UCLA and worked hard to preserve Armenian history, my graduate student colleagues and I knew that studying an Armenian topic or writing about the genocide would mean that we wouldn't get jobs. The dominant narrative embraced by many in Middle East studies and promoted by the Turkish state that Armenians were a disgruntled minority whose claims of genocide were political and not factual prevailed. We didn't teach it in our modern Middle East history survey classes, and it most certainly was not taught in our Ottoman and Turkish history classes, which were taught by the late Stanford J. Shaw, who was among those historians most committed to denial. I remember how terrible I felt when I would write applications for grants, especially to U.S. government agencies, to do research on the history of Aleppo, a city reshaped by the Armenian genocide, and not include the word genocide or even mass deportations and massacre, fearing that a reviewer might interpret my decision to do so as polemical or too pro-Armenian and anti-Turkish, and that would be enough to be denied the grant. Part of my regret was that I was having to live in a land of half-truths to build my career, but also because my father and his family had lived for many, many years in the Middle East and had Armenian friends in Beirut and Baghdad who told him of their stories of survival and histories of massacre and deportations, and even of the denial of the genocide by the Turkish state. So it was a historical fact I had known my entire life. Thankfully, that time has passed. Much of that thanks goes, in fact, to scholars of Turkish citizenship, or original Turkish citizenship, like Taner Akçam or my friend Gabe Çek at the University of Michigan, who pushed aside years of prejudice and denial and followed the historical evidence to the conclusion that genocide happened. And they have been joined by a generation of excellent young Turkish and Armenian scholars with skills in Armenian, Turkish, and Arabic languages to bring a remarkable level of detail to our understanding of the events of 1914. Perhaps the greatest evidence of this change is the fact that this last year, the Middle East Studies Association, which was founded by genocide deniers like Bernard Lewis and Stanford Shaw, awarded Taner Akçam's recent book its most prestigious prize, the Albert Buran Book Award. I played a small part in that change. In late 2010, the American Historical Review, which is the leading history journal in the United States, published an article I wrote called "The League of Nations Rescue of Armenian Genocide Survivors and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism." This was the first research article on the Armenian genocide in that journal's 115-year history, and was significant in that no peer reviewer of the article criticized it for using the word genocide. No editor asked me to put the word in quotation marks, and I was never told to provide balance for the Turkish side. The only problems I faced, and my colleagues Mark Melgonian and others are aware of this, were from representatives of the Assembly of Turkish American Associations who attacked my work and me by writing letters implying a possible libel suit for my defense of it in writing. Although that was a real hassle and a waste of time, I figured that I must be doing something right if these were the ones attacking me. As the modes of denial have moved from the mainstream to the periphery, there has been a change in the way denial has been funded and operates, and also in the way it uses the language of post-structuralism and the accusation of Islamophobia. In general, I tend to ignore denial, content in the knowledge that a real turn has taken place. But I found myself drawn back into the discussions of Armenian genocide by a book review in the International Journal of Middle East Studies that just stood out for all the wrong reasons. In early 2012, IJMIS, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the leading journal of the community of scholars who study Islam in the Middle East, and at the time I was on the editorial board of that journal, published a review written by retired Marine Corps colonel and historian of Ottoman military history, Edward Erickson, of the book Armenians and the Allies in Cilicia, 1914-1923, published by the University of Utah Press in 2010. Authored by the Turkish diplomat Yücel Güçlü. Book reviews in IJMIS tend to stay clear of controversy and usually do a good job discussing source material and the usefulness of the text to the broader field, as one would expect of a journal of record. Erickson's review, however, was an undue encomium that praised the diplomat's work because it will, quote-unquote, enrage the Armenian lobby, and Dr. Güçlü is certain to be cast as a genocide denier. However, anyone, including constituents of the Armenian lobby, who was interested in the Armenian relocations should read this book. I applaud the University of Utah Press for having the courage to print it, unquote. Beyond the problem that Erickson chose to reduce what's become a rich historical conversation on genocide, mass violence, and human rights to one side in a narrative framed of partisan battle, simply put, the historical consensus around the fact of the Armenian genocide is not the work of a lobby. On the other hand, in using the words he does, Erickson is reproducing official Turkish government policy, which does deny that what happened to the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire during World War I was genocide, and blames continuing calls for the study and recognition of the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians on ethnic, quote-unquote, Armenian lobby. Moreover, to get a sense of how inflammatory Erickson's use of the words enrage and lobby could well be, just substitute the name of any other people that has faced genocide, displacement, or mass violence in the above sentence, and imagine the legitimate outcry that would follow. Curiously, The very same language appears in Erickson's Middle East Journal review of another book denying Armenian genocide, Armenian History and the Question of Genocide, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2011 by Michael Gunter. Quote, compliments are in order to the editors of Palgrave Macmillan for courageously publishing Gunter's work, which is bound to antagonize the powerful Armenian lobby, unquote. Which is similar to his comment appearing in the book's promotional material. Quote, of particular note is Gunter's comprehensive exposition of the evolution of the indispensable and hypermobilized Armenian lobby. It is an indispensable read for anyone seeking to understand these events, unquote. As the blurb confirms, Erickson didn't just review the book after it was published, but he also endorsed the book beforehand, as did M. Hakan Yavuz, the director of the University of Utah's Turkish Studies Project, Jeremy Salt, a political scientist at Bilkent University in Ankara, and Michael Rubin, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and former editor of the conservative Middle East Quarterly. Moreover, Erickson has written reviews for the Middle East Journal similar in tone and depth with two other books from the University of Utah Press that deny the Armenian genocide, Gunter Louis' The Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey, A Disputed Genocide, University of Utah Press, 2005, and Justin McCarthy's The Turk in America, University of Utah Press, 2006. Closing the circle, the same Michael Gunter, praised by Erickson, wrote a laudatory review in Ijmas, and Erickson has recently published a book chapter in an edited volume in the University of Utah Press series edited by Yavuz. What all the aforementioned books have in common is that they are among the 19 titles that the political advocacy organization and the chief sponsor of the University of Utah's Turkish Studies Project, the Turkish Coalition of America, promotes and distributes for free to university, college, and public libraries upon request. On that list are also two of Erickson's own books on Ottoman military history. Indeed, like Salt, Louis, McCarthy, and Gunter, Erickson is identified on the TCA's website as a quote, unquote, reputable scholar who, quote, challenges the conventional one-sided anti-Turkish narrative and or refrains from alleging the crime of genocide, unquote. The recurrence of names and institutions and the seeming coordination that this implies, the consistency of the message of genocide denial shared by books and reviewers, and the fact that these books emanate either from the same press or their authors have been benefited from support by the TCA raises critical questions, including the proper role of foreign governments and political advocacy groups in supporting scholarship in the American Academy, as well as the integrity of the peer review process in university press publishing and the promotion in scholarly venues of the denial of the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians during World War I. These issues bear as well on the larger question of the historian's responsibility to the past. It is not just a question of method or the burden to get it right, which are the primary building blocks for an ethical relationship with the past. In fields affected by intense political contestation, where non-academic organizations seek to exert control over how the past is understood, studied, and taught, for the historian then there is the added responsibility to speak out when the past is targeted for systematic falsification by individuals and groups who are driven by, among other things, ideologies of hate and the express needs of a foreign state, supported by outsized sums of money from political groups, and possessed of a willingness to abuse the civil and criminal legal systems. At the outset, one of the most basic questions about method and ethics that should be asked is when do contrasting views of genocide fall into the category of historical revision, and when are they denied? Denial as a phenomenon isn't the outcome of a good faith effort at historical research that just gets it wrong, something I'm sure that has been discussed at length already in this meeting. Nor is it some kind of difference in professional opinion and historical interpretation. What distinguishes genocide denial from the professional practice of historical revision is that it is done to promote a particular political or social agenda that is implicated somehow in the denied genocide. Regardless of the specific subject, the project of genocide denial depends for its success in large part on the subversion of established principles of collegiality and systems of professional scholarship and review. Also, denial is a legacy of genocide itself. This is clearly the case for Güçlü, who denies that what happened to the Ottoman Armenians was genocide in several ways, though all within the standing repertoire of denial. The most troubling way, however, is his shifting of responsibility for the genocide away from the Ottoman state and onto the Ottoman Armenians, claiming that they brought upon themselves their own destruction by revolting against the Ottomans. This despite the fact that while limited resistance to deportation did occur in central Anatolia, there is no historical evidence for a coordinated mass uprising by Armenians against the empire, and indeed, most historians of the period concluded that Armenians did not rebel, even when they faced mass displacement. Were it true that such a rebellion had occurred in the way Güçlü has suggested, it is still inconceivable that it could justify the kind of organized mass violence against Armenian civilians who were citizens of the Ottoman Empire, including mass rape that took place, or even explain why the Ottoman state engaged in more bureaucratically organized and centrally administered measures against non-combatants, like the forced transfer of Armenian children to Turkish families, or orphanages, or the sequestration of Armenian property, neither of which seem to be connected to the necessities of wartime security. Blaming the victim, which is what Güçlü does, is not a neutral rhetorical term. It is consistently employed by those who commit genocide and other forms of mass violence to explain their actions or defend them after the fact. It is usually a sign of underlying social prejudice, even animus, and in most cases is a tool used by the very powerful to violate the human rights of women and ethnic, social, and religious minorities. But there are additional questions about the book and its author that Erickson's review evades and seems to have gone unnoticed in the process of peer review at the University of Utah. Most notably that as Güçlü is a senior career Turkish diplomat, not a university-based academic, the books, articles, and book reviews he writes tend to follow, as one would imagine of a professional representative of the Republic of Turkey, the Turkish government's position and narrative, not just on the denial of the Armenian genocide, but also a whole range of other historical issues. In this particular case, the diplomatic agency of Güçlü's work is further underscored by the fact that passages of his Armenians and Allies first appeared in a 2007 document called Statement of Facts, prepared for members of the U.S. House of Representatives on behalf of the Turkish-American Heritage Political Action Committee, Turkish PAC. At the time, Turkish PAC was lobbying to prevent passage of a resolution in Congress recognizing the Armenian genocide. No author is given for the document, but like Güçlü's work on late Ottoman history, it invokes the name of Raphael Lemkin, who first articulated the legal theory of genocide during World War II, and argues that the historical record does not justify the use of the term genocide to describe what happened to the Ottoman Armenians in 1915. Somewhat more disturbing is that this is evidence of either the unacknowledged appropriation of another's work as one's own, or a close and undisclosed collaboration between an official representative of a foreign government, Güçlü, at the time the first counselor of the Turkish embassy, and a tax-exempt domestic organization that, according to the Nonpartisan Center for Responsive Politics, contributes tens of thousands of dollars to American politicians. Still, to reproduce the Turkish government's official narrative and Armenians and the Allies, Güçlü got facts just plain wrong. The most telling instance of this final point is his assertion that Raphael Lemkin, as seen in the parallel passages that I cite in the article that accompanies this talk, intended that the word genocide only be applied to the Shoah. Lemkin's thought was shaped by the Holocaust, of course, but his construction of legal theory of genocide incorporated the history of mass violence against other peoples, including the Armenians and the Syrians of the Ottoman Empire. It is difficult for me to understand how this could have escaped editorial and peer review, and it points to a seminal theoretical failure that colors the remainder of Güçlü's work. In the end, Güçlü as a diplomat has an agenda different from that of the professional historian. By the same token, one could even argue that he isn't bound by the ethics and practices of the profession. He may believe he is just doing his job to protect his state's vision of the past for political use in the present. This is in line with an observation by Miguel Gerchek that the task of promoting genocide has been largely entrusted by the Turkish state to active or retired Turkish diplomats. Yet with these substantial concerns about the scholarly value of Güçlü's work in mind, why was this book published by an American research university press in the first place? My only thought would be that what may have happened is that the series editor sent the manuscript to individual scholars whose own views would ideologically cohere with those of the author, and not necessarily to specialists of Ottoman history familiar with the archival evidence and its original languages, or cognizant of the larger historiographical issues and context of the events of 1915-1922, or even the history of genocide. But also, Güçlü's monograph is just one in a collection of books that has come out of the University of Utah Press over the last decade that deny the genocide. I've already mentioned several of these. Many of these books have been published since the creation of the University of Utah's Turkish Studies Project. The TSP was established with a multi-year grant of almost $1 million from the Turkish Coalition of America in 2009 and is directed by Yavuz. In addition to providing grants and scholarships, the TCA engages in congressional outreach and takes delegations of American politicians and Native Americans to Turkey. The TCA's official policy is that what happened to the Armenians, while tragic, wasn't genocide. According to the 2010 annual report of the TCA, its money was used in part to support the publication of the books of McCarthy and Güçlü, as well as Michael Gunter's Armenian History and the Question of Genocide. While the TCA's support is not indicated anywhere in the books by Gunter and Güçlü, its assistance is noted in McCarthy's. The TCA's assistance to the Utah Turkish Studies Project extends beyond its publication of the sponsorship of conferences, as well as graduate and postdoctoral research fellowships. Indeed, the TCA appears to play a continuing decision-making role in how its money is spent at the university. According to the TSP website, a representative of the TCA is involved in the selection process for its grants and fellowships, and the program is overseen by an advisory board including Turkish politicians, journalists, and businessmen. The final ethical cost of this project is put in a broader context by the fact that beyond providing assistance to the University of Utah's TSP to promote the denial of the Armenian genocide in scholarly forums, the TCA has attempted to interfere with academic research and scholarship on it elsewhere. In November 2010, the TCA sued on behalf of the University of Michigan undergraduate, the University of Minnesota, and its director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Holocaust scholar Bruno Chouet, claiming that they had violated the students' First Amendment rights and defamed the TCA by including its website on a list of unreliable resources on genocide at the homepage of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. My friend and colleague, Luan Tosian, who's here, was present through all of that. The entire case was eventually dismissed with prejudice by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit Court. In its ruling, the court upheld the academic freedom of scholars associated with the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies to exercise scholarly judgment about groups like the TCA. It's critical, and I'll conclude with these thoughts, that historians not be a party to the abuse of history, and organizations like the Middle East Studies Association must redouble their commitment to excellence in scholarship, support the kind of research and writing represented by the new history of the late Ottoman Empire movement, which so many of the young people that I meet in Ottoman and Turkish studies are involved in today. And be vigilant on behalf of those fields, like my field, facing so many non-academic challenges, including challenges to the history of mass violence and human suffering at the end of the Ottoman Empire. It is in cases like that of Güçlü's book that the integrity of the scholarly method, in this case the historian's craft, be protected by institutions built for that purpose. As Jean-François Lyotard has argued on the meaning of Auschwitz and the project of denial, it is up to the historians to take into account not only the damages, but also the wrong. Not only the reality, but also the meta-reality that is the destruction of reality. Thank you.
We'll be presenting this paper. his paper on evidentiary thresholds, hierarchies of proof, and the technical denial of mass atrocity crimes in Burma, a case study in failure. Ken?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Excuse the title. I plan to make the paper a little simpler, and I put it there to give you a sense of the issues I'm dealing with. Oh, thank you. When the organizers of the conference invited me to participate, I was surprised, confused, and a bit at a loss of what to do. I've worked on Burma human rights related issues for more than 15 years now, primarily in terms of advocacy, documentation, and policy analysis. Denial was not a major feature of my work. In fact, it didn't feature at all. But I took the challenge and said, well, let me think about how I can make my work on Burma speak to the conference topic. Hence the strange title, and I'll explain what I mean. In exploring the applicability of the idea, I decided to pull back from my presentation today and not focus so much on the intricacies of the legal proceedings I explore in depth in the paper, some of which have read them, not all of you. So what I'm going to do is step back and talk about the larger concepts, which might be considered the underlying concepts, which lies underneath denial and makes it possible. And my goal is in doing so, hopefully come up with some ideas, some concepts, some methodologies that are useful to a wider range of you. So when I first began, the obvious choice, as we've heard today, is to go the rhetorical route. And there is much to be gained by that. I'm not in any way downplaying or dismissing that. But I wanted to look at what makes certain forms of rhetoric of denial and efforts to counter that denial possible. What does it presuppose? And that's where I began. So one of the interesting things about the very complicated situation in Burma since 1948, in which there have been dozens and dozens of insurgencies. In the 1990s, there were as many as 30, and the kinds of conflict and violence and displacement that it engendered, is the absence of understanding. That is, when you go to Burma and speak with Burmans in the central part of the country, there is almost no awareness of what's been happening for more than 6 decades in the country's periphery. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is the military's control over mass media, the silences about soldiers who come home who don't talk about their experiences, and another one is the language we use internationally to make sense of what is happening and what it is possible to do. So I have a couple quick slides. This is an image of a village being burned from some researchers I work with. These are IDPs, internally displaced persons fleeing a military attack. Here are the temporary shelters that people reside in when displaced. They may spend days or months, in some cases, years in the forest. You can just maybe barely see the person inside. And what you've seen happen by NGOs over the past 30 years or so is the development of systematic and professional forms of human rights documentation, fact-finding, that has helped bring to bear, or make visible, I should say, to the international community, which should be bracketed, what is actually happening in areas that you are otherwise not able to reach. So I'm going to be talking particularly about a period 2006 to 2008, and this map gives you a sense of how heavily militarized Eastern Burma had become, and the particular loci of forced displacement. So that's just a reference point. What I'm going to begin with, which I don't like to do, is to read. And it's the beginning of my paper, and effectively a long abstract, which will contextualize my comments that follow. This paper examines the failure of the United Nations to pass a binding resolution authorizing a commission of inquiry into the mass atrocities Burma's armed forces allegedly committed from 1992 to 2008. This particular failure is not unique to Burma. Concerted efforts to authorize an international commission of inquiry in instances where mass atrocities, that is ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide have occurred or are known to be occurring have routinely failed since the founding of the United Nations. Nonetheless, the failed campaign I feature in my longer paper is important for several reasons. First, the case foregrounds the role technical issues played in the accumulation, corroboration, and comparison of facts regarding the human rights situation in Burma. Second, the tactics that an international law clinic based at Harvard used to do so were mimetic in nature. That is, they represented the UN's own resolutions and reports and other documents produced by its own organs in the attempt to convince the Security Council to act on what the United Nations had already concluded, namely, war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed and continue to occur thanks to the armed forces. Third, both processes provide insights into what Henry terms contemporaneous denial, which he defines as, quote, the rationales put forth for not taking action to prevent or to intervene in the internal affairs of another country, unquote. Geopolitical concerns, often glossed as realpolitik, are the most obvious reasons behind contemporaneous denial, but they are not the only one. Technical concerns also matter. As a result, my focus in the paper is on specialized documents, the conceptual fields in which experts deploy them, and the effects bureaucratic procedures have on their ability to do so. My choice to focus on these issues rather than the human ones, as you saw in the photographs, is a strategic one. It enables me to direct attention at two related knowledge practices at the center of human rights documentation, and I believe are relevant to our discussions today about denial. Namely, how does one determine evidentiary thresholds? At which point does something cross a line and become something else? And the hierarchies of proof, that is the standards we use to judge and evaluate these claims to determine whether they are true or not. So why these two, evidentiary thresholds and hierarchies of proof? Well, as we saw in our previous presentation, professional judgment is at the heart of what we do as scholars. It is at the heart of what experts in various fields do. But what we often fail to do is try to understand what are the assumptions upon which these ideas are based. Now, to do so, I borrowed an idea from a scholar named Kristen Well, who's written a fascinating book called Paper Cadavers, in which she details how people went about salvaging, organizing, and systematizing an archive based on 75 million documents rescued from the National Police in Guatemala. It was an accidental discovery. They were in dire need of assistance, and she provided some assistance, but more importantly documented how they created this archive for future use. And she uses these two concepts and notes that they operate on different logics. The first one is called Archives of Pain, and that comes from one of her informants, and it has a double-edged meaning. The first, Archives of Pain, helps capture the forms of documentation state security forces use to keep track of state-sponsored violence, state-sponsored terror, the photographs, the dossiers, the interviews, the other kinds of record of people they interviewed and disappeared. Archives as weapons are instances where groups are able to take state archives and turn them against them as proof, as evidence. Here is your own material, produced by your own personnel, that shows X, Y, or Z. Intentionality being a key one. Right? So the logic it seems at first glance opposite. The first one is repression, state repression. The other one are accounts of victimization, what happened to victims of state repression. She argues, and I very much agree with her, that when you're working with competing archives, whether they be official state archives or state archives and unofficial archives, you need to put them in dialogue with one another because of the forms of bias, the patterns of omission, the types of silences that characterize both of them. They cannot be understood separately, but only through being put into conversation or in relation to one another. And that is at the heart of the failed effort that I discuss in my paper. Now, beginning in 2003, as the human rights situation in Burma began to badly deteriorate, you saw the beginnings of what came to be known as a Commission of Inquiry campaign. That there was a series of fact-finding reports written by very credible bodies urging the United Nations, and in particular the Security Council, to take action to deal with the situation. With tens of thousands of people being killed every year, 500,000 people displaced, and other kinds of humanitarian crises, malnutrition, child mortality, and so on. And this was the sequence. The paper, or the document I'm talking about, are focused on, was produced by the International Law Clinic and Human Rights. And they did something quite interesting. That is, they narrowed their focus to use exclusively UN documents, not documentation by other groups that could be criticized for political bias or bad methodology, but what the UN itself had determined its own conclusions. And it did three other strategic things. One was the temporal focus. They began looking at UN resolutions, reports from special rapporteurs and so on, which dated back to 1993, but with a special focus on 2002 to 2008 when the report was finished, because that coincided with the creation of the ICC, and the Rome Statute could possibly apply to perpetrators if held to account. Second, spatial focus. I showed you a map earlier. The violence was at its worst in eastern Burma, targeting non-majority populations who were overwhelmingly civilians, but it was also representative, so they could use the documentation but make claims about what was happening elsewhere. Lastly, they focused on 4 specific crimes that were well supported in international law, either under jus cogens norms or under the ICC, the 4 being forced displacement or mass deportation, sexual violence against women, extrajudicial executions, and torture. So there was a pre-existing framework, primarily human rights law, but also humanitarian law, they could use to frame their discussion. So how did they and other groups go about justifying intervention? Well, they went carefully through and looked at when the UN Security Council had actually taken action over this period dating back to 1990. And they found that there were 6 basic categories that were invoked by the Security Council to justify what they did. And as you can see them here, overthrow of a democratic government, conflict amongst factions, refugee outflows, and so on. And it's striking that some of them only had 1. Others had at most 4. Burma had all 6. And there was a question of, given that, why hasn't more been done? Why hasn't there been action? Okay. So one of the central issues, to come to some of the technicalities I find so fascinating, and I hope you do as well, is this notion of a threat to international security and peace, which is enshrined in the UN Charter. Unfortunately, the definition is circular. What is a threat? Well, anything that undermines peace, and how do we get peace? We deal with the threat, and it doesn't really tell you anything. So security has and remains so largely an empty signifier. And so what you have to do is go through to prove a threat, identify these 3 categories. Widespread and systematic, that is extensive in scale and proportionality. It is committed in a context of impunity, that there is clear command and control relationships between high-ranking officials and low-ranking ones that commit the crimes, and that it rises to the level of state policy, that it continues over time. So one of the challenges, and I think we heard this in the discussion of the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian Genocide, is, well, what do you do when you can't access the documentation? How do you go about reconstructing and proving it? So there are 3 essential problems to this. One is extensiveness, also called the quantum requirement. What numbers do you need in scale or proportionality to prove this is widespread and systematic? It varies radically by case. Command and control, also very difficult to prove. People more often go after joint criminal enterprise, which is a way of holding an individual responsible for crimes he or she committed, but that undermines the ability to prosecute for genocide. Easier to convict one, but it undermines your broader purpose. And continuation, similar question. How long does the violence need to continue? How intense does it need to be? These are all issues that are subject to much debate. And they link very directly with Stanley Cohen. Somebody mentioned him earlier this morning, The 3 Forms of Denial. I love the article. I was surprised it took me so long to find it. And what I did is look through these strategies about making the case and critiquing the case for UN security action, the different forms of denial that were invoked. And I will walk you through them right now. One of the key issues that emerges from the Burma case that I think is also relevant to many of us in the room is the reverse justification argument. That the situation is such that it is so bad that we can bypass norms, we can bypass laws or other kinds of existing procedures because we have to act now. Does that hold for climate change? Does that hold for cigarettes? Does that hold for many of the issues we've heard today? Excellent question, but what are the risks and costs of saying it's okay for us to do this, to deny these things actually apply to us because of the situation, and which ones don't, and for whom? I'm about out of time, so I want to put 2 other things on the table that hopefully we can discuss throughout the remainder of the afternoon. The first is what I call epistemological denial. That is, categories and indicators, which are often indicators created out of other indicators, they're meta-categories, have biographies. That they come from somewhere, they contain biases, they reflect cultural preconceptions, notions of temporality, intentionality, and so on. But we often don't pause to think about them. We need to look at or interrogate how we think we know what we know. And that entails getting at these, some of the technicalities I discussed. Procedural denial, my last point as I wrap up. People often gloss over. I know my eyes glaze over when I start looking at UN documents and their procedures and the way in which lawyers make everything impenetrable to ordinary human beings, also to themselves in some cases. But I think it's critical that some of us pause and take a look at how these things underlie and shape debates about what does and does not constitute denial, and as some of us suggested this morning, how we go about engaging with it, taking it apart, offering alternative models in ways that don't perpetuate a polarized situation that leads nowhere. So I'll stop there and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. We'll now hear about addressing rhetorical patterns of denial when climate change, evolution, and the Holocaust never happened.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I think it's great that I'm going after Ken because I'm going to be bringing it back to rhetorical theory in order to avoid some of that stickiness that comes when we discuss epistemic questions. So thank you for having me. I'll first just say that my main research thrust looks at the relationship between religion and science. And all of the cases that I'm looking at here, Holocaust denial, evolution denial, and climate change denial, do have a common theme of religious denial and roots in Christianity. So I'm going to be looking at how they present sort of this alternative story, guiding story, and how science and history kind of violate this ultimate divine story. So my main arguments and takeaways for this presentation is that that rhetoric provides us a third way to sort of look at this situation where it's not about epistemological questions of truth and facts and expertise, but taking these sides on the same terms and looking at how they are, as Ken stated, in conversation and in concert with one another to understand the larger picture. So I'm looking at the patterns across the denialism from an argumentative rhetorical perspective, and how there's a unique cultural moment happening here where polarization is allowing a lot of these voices to become louder and become more recognized in the public sphere. So I hope you excuse the necessary brevity since I'm going to be talking about the 3 case studies, but I'm happy to elaborate more on them, especially my area of expertise, which is the evolution denial and creationism, in the Q&A if you find it interesting. So I first think that the similarities between Holocaust denial, climate change denial, and evolutionary denial stem from similar frameworks that construct the attitudes and behavior, and I base that on Burkean theory, which I'll go into. And we talked previously about you might call it a truth regime or web of belief, but Burke calls it a guiding orientation or framework. The way people use language and construct their rhetoric creates a way of viewing the world that is incredibly difficult to overcome. So instead of structuring these as debates, assuming forensic rhetoric, right and wrong, guilt and blame, looking at them as stories provides us a way to turn to deliberative rhetoric and how we can focus on action and solutions to these problems, I hope. Okay, so just a quick Burkean summary that the importance of language and the way we use language and the way we view the world is how we individually construct truth. So it's not just that truth exists and it's out there, but that it's a matchup of our expectations of what reality is and then the observations that we see. So I talk in the paper about some of the history of socializations, the different ways that we come to know what truth are by what our families tell us, what our networks tell us, maybe what our religion might tell us. And the language that we use is a direct result of those expectations that we hold and what we're socialized into. And Burke argues that in trying to reflect our own realities and language, we necessarily make choices about what we say and what we don't say. And because of that, any type of framework that we have will necessarily be deflective of other types of languages that we are excluding. So Burke argues that these frameworks are nearly impossible to shift because when having these orientations and frameworks, it guides our very identity and how we see the world. So simply introducing new information where if it is powerful enough can cause casuistic stretching, Burke calls this is incredibly difficult. He notes that insofar as we do not travel light and thus assemble much intellectual baggage, the attempt to reshape this to new exigencies requires considerable enterprise. So it's something to just say about human nature that we don't really want to undergo this considerable enterprise. It's a lot easier to kind of perform mental flips in order to make new information fit what we already know than try to change our entire framework. So with that as the operating framework I'm going to be using, I've noted during my research on the Holocaust, evolution, and climate change denial, 3 common strategies. And they all focus on the overarching framework or narrative that these denialist groups are using. Primarily in constructing a conspiracy theme and story, which constructs a villain or an other, which in the cases I'm talking about are science or history. And then because of that story, any material evidence that emerges from historians and from sciences are excluded or included as a part of the conspiracy, and thus can be discarded. And finally, it shifts the burden of proof on historians and scientists to prove there is no conspiracy, instead of offering their own positive proof that something is actually conspiratorial. So in constructing an enemy, this is a strategy that Burke directly talks about in Holocaust denial and Hitler's rhetoric, which constructed Jews and other persecuted groups as an evil, insidious enemy that was polluting Germany. So in the story, Germans are the heroes, and people who are supporting Hitler are the heroes that are obligated to vanquish that enemy that is responsible for the pollution in the system. It's a lot easier to create a scapegoat, Burke says, than to mortify oneself and say, okay, let's look at the actual problems going on. It's easier to just name and label a villain and thus prescribe action against them. Which is what Burke says that Hitler was so successful in doing. So this constructs an oppositional group where the denialists themselves become the heroes of the story, and they are obligated, no matter the evidence against them, to actually fight. And there's surveys to say that actually in providing more evidence to the contrary of the conspiracy supports and makes them more zealous, because then there's more against them that they are then obligated that much more to fight against and to bring enlightenment. So I already mentioned, so Jews become the perfect villain in the story of Holocaust denial. In climate change, there's a lot of evidence to say that there's a conspiracy narrative where any kind of attempts at environmental protection are actually insidious claims either for scientists to get money for their research, or even furthermore that there is a one world government plan that organizations like the UN are trying to instill. I'll read a quote from a book by Glenn Beck called Agenda 21, which is a UN-led action plan that was voluntary for countries to sign, just saying that they supported environmental protection, but they made it into a dystopian novel. And the tagline is, "Just a generation ago, this place was called America. Now, after the worldwide implementation of a UN-led program called Agenda 21, it's simply known as the Republic. There's no president, no Congress, no Supreme Court, no freedom. There are only the authorities." So this book is just one example of many conspiracy narratives out there where people who are supporting climate change, supporting environmental protection, are really just these minions and pawns trying to instill this one world government where, and this is obviously a very extreme example, but it kind of gives you an idea about the extent, the logical extent that you have to follow to think that something simple as trying to impose a carbon tax or protect the environment really has a lot of these insidious underlying aspects. And another example from evolution denial is an institution called the Institute for Creation Research. They publish a monthly magazine that's trying to counter the lies of evolution. And they're very adamant that evolution is its own type of religion that's trying to impose immorality and poison the minds of the youth. And I'll read a quote from one of the main spokespeople of the ICR who said, "One of the most amazing phenomena in the history of education is that a speculative philosophy based on no true scientific evidence could have been universally adopted and taught as scientific fact. Evolution is the established religion of the state that has a virtual stronghold on education perpetrated by the humanistic elite." So there's this idea that actually the denialists are the ones that are enlightened, I think as Sean mentioned earlier, and the historians and scientists are actually the fools that need to be better informed and are the elites that are trying to quell kind of true inquiry. So I'll move on to the second strategy I found, which is rejecting evidence. And it logically follows from the first. If we don't trust the sources of this information, we obviously can't trust the sources of evidence that they propose or that they claim through the basis of their credibility. So it's not just the facts, it's not just the experts and the elites, but that relationship that they all fall under this conspiracy narrative that they can't be trusted. So even if you could present material evidence that meets their very difficult standards, it can still just be dismissed, again, as fabrications or some kind of elaborate manipulation of the facts. So I'll read a quote from the American Nazi Party website where it said, "I have yet to find anywhere amongst National Socialism as an ideology that advocates the extermination of Jews or anyone. Only the enemy's versions about us are those lies to be found." So on this website, they decry any type of material evidence posted by anybody, submitted to forums, as merely fabrications. Oh, that doesn't count, that doesn't count. I still haven't found evidence, bring me the evidence, right? But any evidence that's brought forward is just discounted. It's only the enemy's version, which is obviously constructed under the conspiracy narrative and can be discounted. ClimateGate came up earlier, but I will bring that up again, where evidence that emails were leaked out of the IPCC about the natural uncertainty that comes when we discuss climate change and the uncertainty measures in the scientific research, and it was used to oppose funding in Congress. It was used a lot on the blogosphere to just say, hey, we can discredit all of the IPCC reports and policy standards because we can doubt this evidence here as being manipulated and fabricated. Despite reports obviously clarifying that that's not what was happening in the emails, still a very pervasive myth. And then the last example I have of rejecting evidence comes from an interview with Wendy Wright and Richard Dawkins, where she discounts any evidence in museums as showing transitional forms in evolution. She requests that Richard Dawkins bring her physical fossils to show her transitional forms from one species to another, to which Richard Dawkins replies, you can go to any museum and find fossils. Maybe they're casings of fossils, maybe they're not the original ones, but any fossil could be qualified as a transitional form. And she makes a request that it actually be a transition between one species to another and not microevolution, which is obviously a misunderstanding of evolution. But nonetheless, she creates this standard that Richard Dawkins can't adequately answer in the interview, and he gets a little befuddled. It's a very strange request that simply can't be fulfilled. Anyway, so that kind of also discounts the evidence that is present in museums as not qualifying or meeting her standards. Finally, I will discuss shifting the burden of proof. So not only are the experts and elites not trusted because they're villains. Not only do they manipulate evidence, but they are also required to have all of the burden. It's not that the deniers can thus bring out counter-evidence. They can simply just denounce or deny or doubt the evidence that's already been established. They don't have to produce positive evidence themselves. And I based this, I looked to Pennock a lot in this area, in this topic, because he specifically looked at creationism that said that breaking down the positive evidence for evolution is all that creationists need to do to establish their own position, because they create a false dichotomy where it's either evolution or creationism. So anything that discounts or doubts evolution is then considered positive proof for creationism. It's obviously a logical fallacy, but it's used a lot in the textbook debates, where, well, if the science doesn't answer this question, obviously there's a gap. Here's your answer. Creationism should be, in the textbooks. So I think I have other examples from climate change, the conflation of weather and climate, proved to me that because it's snowing, it's not climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll just jump quickly to potential solutions. I think we can think about shifting the burden back. We can think about ways to break down this narrative of conspiracy and offer views of the villains, as victims or just as not villainous. We can also offer additional evidence and try and say, hey, well, where's your evidence? But I think what's more important, and I think that our keynote Brendan talked about yesterday, was what are these operational frameworks that are causing these behaviors and attitudes and strategies? If we can get at what those underlying frameworks are and what the issues are that are promoting these attitudes and these strategies, that could be a way to stop them from emerging in general, instead of trying to pick a fight against what are oftentimes very successful rhetorical strategies. Thank you.
I'm going to give a few comments on my own. Is Keith hooked in now by Skype? Before I open up to questions, I very much enjoyed reading these three papers and found, despite the fact that on their surface they seem to be quite very different, I found a fair number of things that we could actually combine between them. In particular, the three strategies that Emma points out can be applied to a number of cases that we've heard about today. We heard about the shifting of the burden of proof. Well, certainly we've seen that in a number of different cases. The shifting first starts with just trying to create a doubt. The purpose of the denier is not to make sure everyone believes what they say, but to create enough doubt to muddy the facts enough that it then becomes necessary for the proponents of genocide or of climate change to then have to assume the burden of proof. They have to prove it as opposed to the deniers because they've created enough doubt to do so. Secondly, the idea of denying evidence by saying it's part of a conspiracy. The example Emma gives, of course, is the climate scientists. But didn't we just hear earlier from Keith that the exact same thing is done by the Turkish government and those who deny the Armenian genocide by referring to the Armenian lobby? This powerful Armenian lobby will go crazy because we all know the Armenian lobby is stronger than the Turkish government or the U.S. State Department. They're able to control everything. The third point Emma brought up was this deniers as heroes. And I found this one particularly interesting because it really puts the whole David and Goliath idea on its head. You've got your lonely climate deniers standing up against big science. And please don't look at the man behind the curtain who happen to be the Koch brothers and the entire oil industry, because we know ExxonMobil has no power whatsoever. Similarly, we hear Keith talked about these brave academics who are labeled as deniers if Guklu has written his book. And again, in this case, it's brave Turkish deniers, and please let's ignore the Turkish government, the millions of the Turkish coalition of America, and all the resources they have behind them. They're really the poor Davids. They're not Goliath in Sheep. I'm not going to mix metaphors, but they're not Goliath. Moving on to something Ken wrote, Ken particularly spoke about the command and control relationships are notoriously difficult to prove in saying why the Commission of Inquiry wasn't adopted for for Burma. And this is a key part of genocide denial as well, the idea of command and control. If you again look at the Armenian case, there's two possible ways you can look at it. Number one, what's one of the great denial arguments? Well, that they were supposed to be peaceful deportations. Look, here are the documents showing that their property was supposed to be taken care of, the individuals were supposed to be taken care of. The government lost control of these caravans. Well, that's your command and control argument. It just couldn't be helped. And then there's the other one too. It's like, oh well, Edward Erickson, who Keith speaks about, has gone into the archives of the Ottoman government and of the Ottoman military. And look, there's no evidence here. This is, they thought there was something, really a rebellion, etc. Well, again, who was in control? Was it the Ottoman government? Was it the Ottoman military? Well, no. Who was in control was the Committee of Union and Progress. We all know they were the ones really calling the shots, working behind the scenes. And we have none of their documents because they disappeared at the end of World War I, rather conveniently. So again, the issue of command, even when it comes to going to the documents, that also comes to an issue of command and control. Who was actually calling the shots? The other part that I found coming out of more than one paper was this idea of projection. And we know it's a psychological construct, but I think it works here. Keith wrote about the paranoid tendency of projecting upon others one's own violent aggressiveness and then indicting them. In the Armenian case that Keith wrote about, of course, it's taking the Armenian case and talking about a civil war. It wasn't a genocide, it was a civil war between an army and civilians, but a civil war nonetheless. Or it was a rebellion. Or it was an alliance with a foreign power, in that case Russia. And somehow your own violence is projected upon the person you are actually inflicting the violence on. And now we might say, well, this is happening 80 years later. None of the people who are writing about denial today were actually perpetrators themselves. No, but the first deniers were. And the best example we have, as Henry reminded me, is Esat Uras, or Uras Pasha, who actually was a functionary in the CUP, a functionary in the government, in the Department of Intelligence, who has been shown to actually have been a perpetrator of the genocide, who joined the Turkish Historical Association after the government-sponsored association, and actually has written what is very much the prototype of genocide denial, the Bible. It's a 1,000-page book about the Armenians in history that basically almost all the initial and even continuing denial tactics used by the authors that Keith has spoken about, you can see the roots of it, and sometimes the exact same arguments in Esat Uras. Not to promote myself, I just wrote a paper which was been published by Genocide Studies International, which actually shows McCarthy taking from Esat Uras, shows Gunther taking from Esat Uras, shows Gunther Louis taking from Esat Uras as well. And here it is, a perpetrator covering up his own violence by expressing the fact, no, the violence was actually being done by the Armenians on the Turks. Similarly, Emma also speaks of flipping of history, constructs the persecuted minority as the secret, powerful elites that pull strings and actually run the world. It's the victim that's actually running the world, whether it's the great Jewish conspiracy or the Armenian conspiracy. Fortunately, the advantage we have when it comes to Holocaust deniers is nobody takes them seriously. We don't have to really worry about the American Nazi Party being taken seriously as a source. Unfortunately, we talk about the Turkish government or some of these academics that Keith wrote about, it's a different story. Two last points. Also regarding projection, I think this one's most interesting, is the projection, what's the old story? Follow the money. The projection of, oh, well, you've got to follow the money. In the case of climate scientists, you've got all these climate scientists chasing government grants. They have to say there's global warming or else they won't get the money. But let's compare the money of the climate scientists get to what ExxonMobil is paying other scientists to say the opposite, and we're not even in the same ballpark. Exact same case can be made regarding the Armenian case as well, where the real money, as Keith shows, is actually on the denial side and not on it is a genocide side. Finally, Keith's point regarding the University of Utah and the University of Utah Press, I think, is an important one. Because here you have American academic institutions, who really should know better, lending their credibility to denial of the Armenian genocide. Is this the only place that happens? No. In the other cases as well, you have other institutions lending their credibility. In the case of climate change denial, what institute? Well, you've got large parts of the cadre of elected officials of the Republican Party lending their credibility to climate denial. You have the Fox News channel. Who knows how much credibility they have, but whatever credibility they have, they are lending all the time to denial of climate change as well. And so this is something that should concern all of us, and that we can see through multiple cases where you have the deniers looking for institutions that have credibility to back up their case, and it's something I think we can see across all these different cases. With that, I'd like to open it up to questions for any of the panelists, and as you can see, Keith is here as well, so feel free to ask him any questions. Who would like to ask the first question?
Is that really Keith?
It's just an email. It's just an email.
Excuse me, he can see you. The camera here, he can see you.
Not basically.
But there you go. All right. Now we can see him as well. Questions?
As long as possible, depending on the bandwidth.
Very good. Yes, please.
Hi, patience. I think I was interested when you brought up the notion of the archive. I was wondering if you could, I don't know, in terms of your thinking, went over pretty quickly, but not necessarily just in terms of what Bill said, but maybe also in terms of like Derrida or something, but the archive as a source to archon the archaic, right? It's then replicated, duplicated, but also in terms of the whole notion of truth and denial. How does the archive function?
That's a great question. And it varies tremendously by case. So you're right, I glossed over it quickly. You find this, I'll call it a chain of evidence, or a Xerox machine that does some modification as it goes. So the UN has been largely dependent on fact-finding reports that various NGOs, and very heavily credible NGOs, have been submitting to it as part of its annual collection process. And those reports provide the basis for certain special bodies, but in particular the Special Rapporteur to Burma, Myanmar, to go and investigate certain alleged crimes. So the Special Rapporteur draws upon what we'll call archives of pain, the collection of testimonies from victims and their accounts of what happened. And then that gets translated into the UN's own archive, its own documentation of itself that accumulates over time. So what the Law Clinic did was, rather than going back to these fact-finding reports by local NGOs on the ground that typically represent their own ethnic groups, but actually used the UN's own archive it had produced over 15 years to show what it had already concluded, which was that these crimes were happening, and therefore, under its own regulations, including Chapter 7, it had the responsibility to act, and if the crimes were found, to refer the case to the ICC for prosecution. So it was taking this notion of mimesis I mentioned to convince there is no political bias. This is your own factual, objective representation. Therefore, you should act on it. And if you don't act on it, you must provide the world an explanation as to why you're not exercising your powers under the UN Charter. That failed, as I explained in the paper, in part because the way the UN Security Council, the Human Rights Commission works in terms of drafting and approving resolutions. So it failed due to a joint veto from China and Russia on it because of their own geopolitical interests. But I thought it was an interesting way to begin to think about how groups can move beyond or supplement their work in terms of fact-finding of uses to also looking at how UN bodies or the state itself documents its own operations and how that can be brought to bear as evidence. So thinking about the conference theme of denial, ways in which the procedures of deniers, how they go about putting together their own information to make claims. Sort of attacking the burden of proof. Well, you want to shift the burden of proof, we can bring it back to you and ask you to disclose, ask you to make more transparent, to hold people more accountable. So it's beginning to think of an archive, and I'm not sure I'm getting quite at your question, but using archives as weapons in pursuit of transparency and accountability. So it's drawing upon multiple sources, not just people advocating against naming and shaming, but what you yourself are doing for a particular political purpose. Does that quite get at it, or?
Yeah, no, I thought it was an interesting thing that they were saying to talk about, think about denial and truth makes both, because in both cases you have this archive, whatever it may be, it's sort of almost a sacred thing for making assertions about truth and denial from another perspective. So it seems like you're trying to move away from the notion of some abstract concept of denial to then look down at the bodies of data, information, what's supported, that's out of sight. It's sort of one process that seems important, so I'm glad that you raised that.
Perhaps so one sentence answer is, who counts what and how is critically important, not just politically or ethically, morally, but also, as I tried to suggest, technically. Taking a closer look at how people make quantitative calculations and what they're deployed to do is something we don't do enough of, in my opinion, and that's a great place to start in those archives.
Professor O'Connor?
Hello, Keith. I find it very troubling that we have a sense of helplessness in face of this rampant prevarication that's coming from the University of Utah. As if we have nothing to do, and it seems to me this is wrong. I presume the University of Utah has a director. I don't know who's spoken to that director. I don't know how he can live with what his underling, supposedly, is manipulating. Why isn't there knowledge out there? Who's going to bring this knowledge? And we have all these people who are advocates of Armenian genocide recognition, but this is far more fundamental. In a sense, it's the body of knowledge. And I just was asked to review another manuscript by a Turkish Foreign Service member who also got a PhD from American University recently. On the basis of my review, I presume, the university, that press, rejected the manuscript. And then another publisher contacted me with the same manuscript. And so it's clear to me that if it doesn't get published 1, 2, or 3, it's going to go to Utah, and it will certainly be published there in the series. And most students and others are not aware of these things, and so when they open and are going to do a paper, they find this entire corpus of seemingly convincing, and most convincing of all, unfortunately, is Mr. Erickson's work with all these citations of military archives and documents and so forth. So it seems to me that maybe we, I don't know if it's a community of scholars or a community of advocates, have not done our job. And I'm not, you were there at Utah, you know better than I. And I understand there are those who even spoke to the president of the university. But is there nothing to be done?
Thank you, Richard. Can you hear me? This is the first question.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'll speak slowly and very clearly. I think the first line of defense is precisely what I outline in the paper, which is to redouble efforts at professional societies and organizations. And I think I have to tell this audience that the paper from which this was drawn was part of a larger essay that I submitted to the Review of Middle East Studies, which is the in-house organ for the Middle East Studies Association. And Mark Mamagonian has followed this with me for many years now, it seems. My beard was less gray when it started. That even though we got 3 positive peer reviews and we're willing to work with the editor, the journal refused to publish the essay that was going to discuss all of this. And my suspicion is that the folks who are named in it are litigious, and organizations that aren't as invested in this as many of you are in this room aren't willing to go through the hassle and hell of a nuisance lawsuit. And one of the things that concerns me about my work, and I think Emma Bloomfield, if she looked at it, would see that rhetorically I have to be extremely careful now when I write about this to use words that are very clearly established my own opinion and my own interpretation, because there's no desire to provide an opening to some group like the Assembly or Turkish American Association, the TCA, to bring a lawsuit against me. So, I mean, I think what's happened is this strategy employs not just a lot of money to a school that suffered terribly during the recession, like Utah, to a Middle East, at a university where their Middle East Study Center has utterly collapsed because of poor leadership, but also lack of funding from Title VI, where there's really no one on that campus who can interpret what the problems are to the university president, despite the fact that there are Armenians on faculty, and I've personally written to the president of the University of Utah, that essentially an incredible weakness was discovered in the larger academic community, and it was exploited extremely well. And so, you can, as an individual, you can really kind of go crazy going after something like this, but then you always can run into the deployment of the use of the notion of academic freedom by a university or by a faculty member to defend actions in this field. And frankly, there are some of these aspects that fall under the protection of academic freedom. So I think that one of the most important things to do is precisely what Richard does and what others of us do, which is that when we get these horrible manuscripts sent to us, we tell the editor who's sending it to us that they're a piece of crap and they're being done to promote the political agenda of denial, and that they should not be published by a reputable press. But we have very little to do to exert influence on what happens in Utah if there's a press and an editor who are willing to abandon certain ethical concerns and the basis of peer review to promote an agenda. There's very little that can be done. And I don't know if additional money was offered to Utah. I don't know what would work at this point. I think that what just has to be done is that in the fields of peer review, scholarship, review, and journals, to keep hammering away at this. But I'm very frustrated because I think the essay that I wrote talking about this would have been of interest to my colleagues in Middle East Studies. That this is what's happening at the University of Utah. It's something that they probably aren't particularly aware of, but more and more now when people hear University of Utah press, they roll their eyes and say, oh, that press. And it's really a shame, because I don't think, I spent a year in Utah, and I gave a talk about genocide at the downtown public library in Salt Lake, and 200 people showed up. So I don't think the people of the state of Utah would be particularly happy knowing that their university, which is a very good university, is being employed in such a manner. So Richard, I feel like I've done my part, and others can follow suit.
Well, let me just follow up. They have an editor at the University of Utah. Can he not be brought into exactly what you're saying to inquire what is the peer review process, and do they follow what is the accepted peer review process, which is to send their manuscripts also to individuals who might have opposing or different views.
But ultimately, they have an editorial board that should be providing oversight. But remember, the University of Utah, before it got into the business of publishing books on late Ottoman history and these conference volumes that are seem to be these remarkable junkets to places like Tiflis or Sarajevo and so on, they were publishing books about cowboy poetry and dinosaurs. So it's not, and the other problem is that the faculty, there aren't faculty at the University of Utah anymore who even know anything about this issue. They've all retired. The Middle East Center collapsed. And so, functionally, Professor Yavuz has a pretty open field. And he has tenure, and the TCA gives money. And the TCA also provides, obviously, according to their own documentation, provides some subventions to these books. And, when we publish books at an elite press like the University of California, the editors often ask us, do you have a subvention possibility, right? So this is something that in an industry like publishing, which is so close to the margin, which itself is beginning to fail as a industry, that the money is just too good, and it seems to make these other issues go away. Again, we have standards of review, post-publication review, we have journals, we have online publications, we have all these places. I mean, Dikran wrote a great essay, it sounds like, that exposes a lot of this. So, it's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which, it's very easy to imagine a scenario in which outside pressure would be on the University of Utah press, and the University of Utah could be interpreted and could be argued as being undue interference in the academic freedom of the university itself. So, it's a very frustrating situation, and it seems, it doesn't seem, it is unjust. And, it just becomes a situation of acting smart. Look, Justice Brandeis once said, sunlight's the best disinfectant, right? So that's what has to be. The other is, every moment that Richard or Khatib or Luann or any of us spend fighting against this is moments when we're not writing our own books about what we do. So that's the other way to think about this, is that the most corrosive impact of denial, I think, isn't just creating a body of falsified scholarship, it's distracting good scholars from working on the important issues that are facing us that we study. So there's only enough time in the day to write your own books and play with your own kid, and not have to worry about confronting denial. When I was attacked by the ATAA, I think I lost 3 months of my life working with my own administration, consulting private attorneys, drafting and redrafting letters and articles, and that took time. And when I was doing that, I wasn't improving my teaching, I wasn't publishing articles, I was doing that. So that's one of the choices that has to be made, and one of the material aspects of denial that have to be understood is that denial eats away at the time of good scholars.
Thank you, Keith. Other questions? Yes?
I want to follow the comments and pose a question to you. Another type of category of denial is how we call structural or systemic denial. And part of that activity is what the Skype visitor just described. How you can use structures, including on today, the 24th of October, UN Day, very heretically, that particular system and its impact on denial. I'm talking about what happened, particularly with Rwanda. While genocide was in progress, of course, the Security Council and kind of, hegemony that it had over world opinion. So those are things to look at. And could we not decide to describe on examining processes, look at systems and how systems and systems themselves feed on this denial, academic freedom and managing a university and the role of the university presses. The other part of it is, and when you said, let's look at UN reports only, and I know it's the purpose for your research, because these are somehow unbiased reports. I want to take a very, very strong opposition to that, having worked at the United Nations and been looking at some cases in the UN reports that have been some of the most biased documents. And one of the reasons for that is that they rely upon other organizations for what they're gathering, including some very loved organizations like Human Rights Watch that sometimes have their own agenda and themselves have been accused of revisionism and violence. So when a reporter comes out to a situation with a UN hat on, doesn't mean that person or that system is unbiased at all. And there's been plenty of evidence to prove to the contrary. And so as we look at this broad issue of how denial is done and perpetrated, I think also systems should be part of the analysis.
Yeah, I very, very much agree, and I want to sort of work backwards and clarify that one of the patterns of denial in human rights advocacy, as Stanley Cohen's article shows, ways in which states try to deflect criticism on the accusation that these were politically motivated groups that claimed to be independent from foreign insurgencies but weren't. And so the move to using UN documentation only wasn't to imply that UN documentation is unbiased. I'm second in line right after you on that, and certainly is the law clinic. But it was a way of holding up, these were your own conclusions. Under your definitions, under your procedures, under your structures and systems and so on, you yourself already concluded that. So setting aside the question of bias, or they were making a point that wasn't simply a rhetorical one, that, as in the case of Rwanda, if you determine that genocide is happening, certain legal things kick in that require you to act, again, in theory. So one of the things I was trying to do, and I think your point on structural and systemic in that is very, very on point, as Keith's was. One of the tendencies we have, to generalize when we're talking about denial, is getting hung up on definitions, certainly in the human rights field. What constitutes genocide? What constitutes crime against humanity? And those things matter, but to a point you want to have certain flexibility, but not so much flexibility that person X or group X can deny it's actually happening. So you need that little wiggle room. But by focusing on definitions, is it or is it not, you have the binary problem, the threshold problem. And the other thing is you're not looking at what I was getting at with those basic categories, units of analysis with procedures, which again brings me around to your systemic point. And how do you reform the UN? That's been kicked around. How do you reform the Human Rights Council, the UN Security Council? There are lots of proposals. When is it going to happen? I don't know. Maybe after the Utah press is fixed. But it's nonetheless, it's not something we should give up on. But also this challenge, as he pointed out, it takes time away from other things that are equally, if not more important, in how do we take turns in the struggle, how do we divide and conquer, or otherwise marshal our resources to address the Utahs of the world, or the UN Security Councils, but while also not neglecting other important things. And that's where I think having more strategic discussions with academics or other relevant parties about how to deal with whack-a-mole might be beneficial, because we can't and shouldn't be trying to do it alone and sacrificing 3 months of our life or 3 years, whatever the case may be. So, no, thank you for that.
Thank you. Great.
So we're talking about the University of Utah. We'll focus on the hard cases and failures, and I thought maybe we should think about some of the successes. A decade ago, if we were having a denial convention, we'd be talking about Princeton University. And we're not talking about that today. And going from Princeton University to University of Utah is not exactly upward mobility. Well, again, we're talking about the university where cold fusion came from. So there's kind of reputation there. So I should think we ask a question of what happened at Princeton that I think that we could use as a successful example. One thing that happened is one of the key figures there, Bernard Lewis, led the United States into a bloody catastrophe in the Middle East, which we probably can't duplicate, but other things may have happened that we can take advantage of. Comments?
Keith, do you have anything to agree with that?
You want me to talk?
Yeah, do you have anything on? Do you have an idea regarding? Princeton. The main thing with Princeton is that basically the university was shamed. For those who may not remember that, when you have three prominent scholars publish an article showing that their new appointee to the chair of Ataturk chair of Turkish studies had been a ghostwriter for the Turkish ambassador, it was a academic-wide catastrophe and shaming of the university, and that basically, he's never been heard from again, even though he's there. Publicly, he hasn't, because it got to the pages of, say, the Chronicle on Higher Education, covering that. Is something like that possible with Utah?
Well, I want to note that, I've given recently, I've given 2 papers at Princeton on post-genocide humanitarianism in the Middle East. So it doesn't seem like this seems like it's normalized, the situation there. But they still have a full professor and a chair, and who knows who's going to fill that chair next time. But there, it does seem like some of the basic possible self-correcting mechanisms of collegiality were operating. But that's, Princeton has a lot of its own resources. I published my first book that has the word genocide all over it at Princeton University Press. So, it has the ability to be more independent. But look, I think that, I just saw Taner walk by. I can't tell you how happy we all were when Taner won the book prize last year in New Orleans. I think some of us were slightly concerned that, where was the book prize for all the Armenian scholars who had written similar books in the 20 years before and were utterly ignored by the Middle East Studies Association. But we were still very happy that Taner won. As my wife said, we'll take the win where we can get it. But I think that things have really changed. I've been at conferences now recently in Istanbul and other places where there's a kind of, it really seems that the dominant trend, especially amongst younger scholars, is to not just acknowledge, but engage in very sophisticated scholarship. But you still have, at Georgetown University, the Institute of Turkish Studies, which has bought itself into credibility there. University of Utah seems to have a pipeline to Turkish graduate students who come and study at Utah and then return to Turkey's burgeoning higher education sector and this concerns me as well, to continue to teach in Turkish to Turkish young people modes of denial, as well as other sort of aspects of the Turkish nationalist agenda of history. We worry terribly that if they teach these issues in their classrooms, that there's going to be a problem. I think for example, this last year I had an American Council of Learned Societies fellowship in which genocide was in the first sentence, and I got it. So it's very, very different now, and it's different because people produce good scholarship based on archives, but also didn't stop. I think that denial has so terribly deformed the field of contemporary Ottoman and Armenian and Middle East studies, 2 decades ago, that it was really rather painful. And I think it's changed a great deal, and that change has been a consequence of good scholarship. The Utah problem has to be met primarily by good scholarship. That's what will last. I think that continuing to try to expose it in the fora of peer review and post-production review is very important. And I think at some point, I think it will exhaust itself. I really think that's what's going to happen. It just can't. I don't think it can continue. On the other hand, I have two hands, so I can say on the other hand, this Turkish Coalition of America, TCA, seems to make lots of money, and they seem to get good contracts from American defense contractors. So the family that is the chief contributor to it. So they do have resources, and Utah is a school that I think is very good. I wouldn't, it's a major American research university with excellent faculty, but it's also doesn't have a lot of money. So this is very difficult for them to say no to. I'm hoping that when there's a change of personnel, this will happen. But it's so, I think it seems so, I'll conclude with this idea. The situation in Utah seems so terrible, in part because it seems to be the only place left. That it's so marginal now, that it really sticks out. That we wouldn't, we're hard pressed to say there's another press except maybe Palgrave, which is a kind of, it's not a vanity press, but if you sell these books for $120 and so on, they don't really get well circulated. The Utah is now the exception which tests the rule, not the rule. And I think that has to be seen as, to some extent, I don't want to use the word victory, but at least I do want to use the word progress.
Hi Keith, it's Mark. You can't see me, but
Hi,
I'm here. That's okay. He knows what I look like. I agree with all of that, but I also don't want. I don't think we should poo-poo the University of Utah or the University of Utah Press as somehow some podunk press. It's a university press, and to a certain extent, it's good enough. It's good enough for the purpose that these books are being produced to serve. And it may be true that to a large extent, they are mostly being cited by the next publication by the university press, but not exclusively so. There was a book that came out last year, for example, that I just saw recently. It was a bestseller about Lawrence of Arabia, called Lawrence in Arabia. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was well-reviewed, well-received book of popular history, and someone had recommended it to me because it has a lot in it on the Armenians, I was told. And it does. And I picked up a copy. When I went to the footnotes, it recommended, it directed readers to the best available history of the Armenian tragedy, Gunter Louis, the Armenian, and I thought, not Tanarakja, not Hovanesian, not Kevorkian, not any of these other people, but University of Utah Press, 2005. I thought, well, this guy, I don't have any reason to believe that the author of this book has an agenda. He just found his way to a recent book by a university press that looked decent and that helps form the narrative of this book. And that's going to keep happening.
Okay, yes. And, for example, I think that if Taner tried to publish the essay that I submitted for this paper, that the press which owns the journal would probably tell him he couldn't do it.
Yeah, could be.
So, how do you get the word out into circulation without risking a lawsuit? That you're going to be sued for some kind of libel, or you're going to appear to be some kind of conspiracy nut yourself in public. So, these are very difficult issues. And I think that it is worth noting the University of Utah Press is a university press. But hard to judge how widespread the knowledge of how poor the press is. It's very hard to judge that. I don't think that most Middle East scholars would imagine that that press is the go-to press for these issues and tend to steer clear of it. But how does that stop someone who's a non-specialist? How does that stop someone in policy? How does that stop some graduate students and undergraduates at other universities? It doesn't. And also, they've got this great distribution model. So the TCA buys up all the books, and so when like the ATAA threatened to sue me, they sent like this giant box of books to UC Davis that were filled with all of these University of Utah books, which and also to my department, and they gave all the books to me. So
now you have your stuff.
I have all of these books now. It's really, I think it's, I don't want to put this too, I mean, you have to laugh, but otherwise you cry. But the situation here requires a certain degree of consistency in message, I think. That there are questions about this press and its relationship to outside influences, and that it really seems that these are books that couldn't be published anywhere but the University of Utah Press if it weren't for subvention and the abuse of the peer review process. The problem is that I've written the most in-depth documentation of this and have submitted it to peer review, and the press that could have, the journal that could have and should have published it backed off at the last minute for unknown and unstated reasons.
Henry.
First, Keith, send it to Genocide Studies International. If that's an outlet you would want to use, we'll take a look at it, definitely. Second thing is one of the themes that came up, I think, across the papers that was really interesting, or a sort of undertone, was moral accountability, which we haven't talked a lot about. There was a little touch of discussion about this last night in terms of moral courage in the face of being confronted with ideas and information that are uncomfortable for the person dealing with them. But I think each of the talks, and Ken in particular, your discussion of moral consistency, essentially, with the UN, that is looking at the standards that an institution or an individual itself or him or herself has acknowledged as acceptable, and then seeing the problem that they're not, that institution is not even willing to follow through on those, that I think is a very powerful tool of critique, or basis of critique. And I also think, Emma, when you were talking about, dealing with the issue of sort of religion invading the area of science, and as I think I said yesterday, sort of going beyond its reasonable limits of expertise or authority or whatever you want to call it. And what's very interesting though, in a lot of this kind of discussion about evolution and other kinds of things is a real absence of the kind of ethical accountability that I think sort of underlies a lot of what you're saying. And Keith, of course, you were talking about all sorts of issues of moral accountability by presses, by institutions, and so forth. And then the last thing was the heroization of people who should be held morally accountable, and the sort of inversion of that. And I want to give one example and then ask you each to sort of comment in an age of journalistic relativism, academic relativism, moral relativism, and a lot of other very slippery, sort of vulgar postmodernism, bad postmodernist, critiques of all sorts of these kinds of things. How do you make the kinds of moral claims that you're making, and are those useful in countering the problems that we're dealing with? And the example I would give is if the older people among us will remember Elliott Abrams from the 1980s as a Reagan advisor, who, among many other things, was very deeply involved with what genocide scholars generally consider the genocide in Guatemala that killed a couple 100,000 Mayans. and is on public record, Charlie Rose show and so forth, denying that as genocide, justifying all sorts of other things. And he, for a little while now, and he was just reappointed to this position, he's on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Committee on Conscience. Someone who is involved with genocide is now one of the people that is supposed to be alerting us to the threat of genocide. And what's worse is, and I'm going to, I think Mark articulated very well where we can call people deniers when they intentionally deny clearly established facts of great human violence. And he's someone who not only was participating in a certain way in these things, but denied it, and now he's going to alert us to this. So how do you deal with these kinds of things? Is moral accountability any kind of a lever?
So that was a great series of comments, so I hope I can go through all of them. I think in a lot of the situations that emerge between what I study in religion and science is that there is this very unclear who has the moral high ground. In cases of evolution and evolution denial and creationism, creationists claim the high moral ground, saying that they are protecting the youth. They're making sure that morality and ethics stay in the classroom. Whereas the scientists would say, well, you are corrupting and being immoral and being unethical when we look at giving the youth all of the correct information that they need. So both sides, I think, claim the moral high ground. In looking at who is true or who is actually moral, I think follows through my discussion of the hero narrative, where each side has their own narrative about who is the hero and who is the enemy, and the hero must have the moral high ground. So in making myself the hero, or so as in creationism and making them the heroes, they have the moral high ground, so the scientists must be the immoral ones. And that's a really interesting strategy that I think has come up a few times, in that the same argument they use against scientists can be used against themselves. So they say, oh, science and evolution is a religion. You worship Darwin, and thus cannot be trusted, when they themselves use their religion as support for their own argument. So, but I think Dikran noted that it doesn't really matter if you doubt their side, because all they have to do is create doubt in the position that they're trying to undermine.
Oh, I don't have a good answer. But in my view, or in my experience, I should say, where you want to see some positive movement on moral accountability, you have to drop or bracket the language of morality. That is a tactical question. So to come back to Keith's point, if you want to deal with this particular full professor at the press, who is the primary problem point, you try to deal with the press, you try to deal with the president, you try to deal with people and find incentives for them to change their behavior, not the denier themselves. The denier, you're not going to convince, except in rare cases. So I think strategically looking at the situation and identifying where you have points of leverage, where there are decision points where things have to get done on certain deadlines that give you an opportunity, and then finding ways to incentivize the kind of behavior you want to see in the name of accountability. So shame on the museum for Elliot Abrams, who I don't remember well, but you're not going to convince him to resign his position. But double shame on the museum. So that would be an obvious place to start. And the donors. The museum's beholden to its donors. Can't you find donors who are upset at the notion of Abrahams being on the Committee of Conscience? So that's how I would think of approaching the issue. Whether that works, can't say, and I wish you luck with Elliot Abrams. I'm working on Kissinger.
And just very briefly, I mean, I think one of the points I'm trying to make here is that what we should try to expect, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
I think what we should be working is less in the realm of morality and more in the field of, especially in genocide denial, professional ethics and responsibility. Because that's a much more concrete body of behavior. And this is especially, I think, important because you start going down that path, you open yourself up to some of these post-structuralist arguments, which I think can be used to overwhelmingly contextualize the text and the speaker, as well as, I think, it pulls you into the Islamophobia field as well, all of which I think are emerging now as fields of response. And others have written much more fluently about this than I have, so I'm much more interested in these other issues that tend to affect even the way that humanitarian reporting goes to the UN, which is that there are standards of proof, and that there are evidentiary bodies, and that there are ethical responsibilities, and we have tools, and that when those tools are vulnerable to unethical behavior, and it should be called out. So morality doesn't, in this specific instance, doesn't speak to me as strongly as principled professionalism and ethical responsibilities.
Hi Keith, I just want to thank you for your very kind words and for engaging with this issue. You know and I know how much it takes out of you over a long time. But anyway, I was very struck by what you said about how at the beginning of your career it was a struggle to even allow the G word into the classroom, right? And I think now the struggle is to allow the D word into the classroom. And that's the struggle that we're engaged in right now. And I just want to point out, even though it does take a lot out of you, we can point to some victories. The Heath Lowry letter was exposed. The ITS scandal was exposed. The Massachusetts lawsuit, the Minnesota lawsuit, they were lost, right? Because scholars and researchers were willing to engage with the denial, as hard as that was. And the result was, especially in the lawsuits, an actual victory for academic freedom, an unequivocal victory in the federal court for academic freedom. So I appreciate also the point that was just made up here about looking for allies, looking for points of leverage, looking for the incentives, because as I said in my comments this morning, from the perpetrator or the practitioner's point of view, it's about reputation management. It's about reputation capital, and you just have to make that costly through sunlight, as you were saying before. And also, in terms of incentives, I think it's important to make, no, let me back up a little. Just about the connection between denial and genocide, I recall that none other than Talat laid the groundwork for the official Turkish version of events at the CUP's final Congress in November 1918. And the first public declaration of what was going to become the official Turkish position was made by Turkey's lead negotiator and future president, Hizmet Yunani, at the Lausanne conference. Okay, he said the Armenians basically got what was coming to them. Okay, so the point I'm making is it's so tightly wound with genocide, why would we not make the study of denial part of the study of genocide, okay, and not a distraction? Where can our incentive be to make that part of the study of genocide? If we're serious about saying that denial is the final stage, okay? So that is what this conference is doing today, and so I want to thank you, and I thank the organizers for that.
Thank you. Any other questions? This is a good place up. Thank you for a very spirited discussion, and thank you to all the panelists.